Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jacob Rudner here alongside Noah Cameron and Ariel Putterman, and welcome to this week's episode of dTSPN. So with the NBA season wrapping up, it is almost time for the NBA draft coming in at the end of June, where we'll be welcoming 60 new players onto NBA rosters, most of them going on to the Celtics. And the biggest controversy here is going to be in the top 5. We're not quite sure who's going to go where, as the top 5 is really not a lock. It's the top 2 draft picks this year that are the real stars, and everybody after that has kind of fallen into this mediocre to really good status, but nobody is going to come into this being a superstar yet. Buddy Hield had a great season, but I wouldn't even classify him as the top of the line draft picks that's coming into it this year. But the real two that should be discussed right now are Ben Simmons out of LSU and Brandon Ingram out of Duke. Both of them are basically the only two that could possibly go in the front 2 picks. One of them going to the Sixers and the other one going to the Lakers. But in your opinion, which one's going to go first?
I think Ben Simmons will go first. I think Brandon Ingram may turn into the better player, but Ben Simmons' ceiling I think is higher. I think he could turn into the best player in the NBA and maybe give it 4 or 5 years. And I also just think the 76ers, they are not in a rush to be good right now, so they have time to take a player that might take 3 years to be the best, 4 years to be the best, so I think he'll be going number 1.
Now, in terms of Ben Simmons, he isn't really a developed shooter. He hasn't proven that he can shoot from anywhere except for under the basket, layups, and inside that small range of area, but he has been great with his passing, and his rebounding is also fantastic. So one of his good comparisons going into the NBA at best right now could be somebody like a Giannis Antetokounmpo type of player. Do you see that as accurate, or do you think that he could be better or worse than that?
I think that's definitely a possibility. Antetokounmpo he can play every position. You saw the Bucks use him as a small forward, they used him as a shooting guard, they even used him as a point guard. So I think that Simmons is able to do that with his passing ability and his scoring ability and, of course, rebounding.
So going into the NBA, where do you see him playing the most?
I see him playing the 3 or the 4 the most. I think a team in a few years might try him like how they did with Giannis at the point guard, I think more of like a Lamar Odom type player where he's the 4 or the 3 and he just brings the ball up and plays the point there.
So if he does go number 1, then in my opinion that brings Brandon Ingram over to the number 2. And by the way, all these picks that we're discussing right now, and this is the order that we are putting them in, and as you've seen, this is our mock draft that we've created. So in our opinion, going over to the Lakers number 2 is going to be Brandon Ingram out of Duke. He's a 6'9" small forward. He can play power forward. And what do you like about him?
I like really everything about him. He shoots the ball really well. He plays really good defense. I see him at the best for an NBA comparison. I see him like a Kawhi Leonard at the best. I see him being able to play 3 and D type, but he's also going to do so much more. He's a great shooter. He's a great passer, and he's a really quiet but a good leader.
Going over to the 3rd pick overall of the draft, and this one was the most interesting picking for us because a lot of mock drafts have Dragan Bender from the Israeli National Basketball League coming in to the Celtics at number 3, being their first of like 200 picks this year's draft. But for us, we think it's going to be Buddy Hield. We think that he's more of a ready player to go over to the Celtics. Where do you see Buddy Hield falling?
I like Buddy Hield. I think he's a perfect fit for the Celtics. Him and Isaiah Thomas are pretty similar players. I think best case scenario, he could be someone like James Harden, a great shooter. But then, of course, there's the worst case scenario where he's more of a Nick Young, where all he does is shoot. He doesn't really have any other abilities. But I like him as a player. I like him as a teammate. I think he's a perfect fit for the team.
So over to you. Unlike most mock drafts, we have Buddy Hield at the 3. I mean, it has happened in other mock drafts before, but for us, the reason was that he's NBA ready. Do you think that that's the only reason he's capable of sneaking into the top 3, or do you really think that he's a perfect top 3 fit?
I just think it's a fit, like Ariel said, for the Celtics, because the Celtics, this year, they had a really quick rebuild, and they have a bunch of players that mesh well, and maybe besides Isaiah Thomas, they don't really have that star, and especially don't have a star that's not their point guard. And I think Buddy Hield, if he just goes into that rotation, he's a great shooter. I think he's the best shooter in this draft, and they just need someone that can come in and put up 20 points for them per game. Like I said, James Harden type player would be perfect. It's just a great fit for the Celtics. If it was a different team there, I don't know about him, but with the Celtics, I think it's a perfect pick.
So moving on to the Suns' 4th overall pick, and this, in my opinion, is one of the most interesting picks of the draft. And for us, we have Dragan Bender going 4th overall to the Suns, but for me, it's interesting because he's a project. He's a young kid coming out of an underdeveloped basketball league. It's not necessarily known for drawing the most talent out of in the world right now, but in my opinion, he's looking like he could be a Dirk Nowitzki, a Kristaps Porzingis. He's a fantastic basketball player, He's a center power forward that can shoot from the outside. What do you like about him?
I like his athletic ability for a big man. He has kind of a shot which he can definitely improve. The problem is we don't know much about him. He only averaged about a point per game out in Israel, and we just don't know. So he can, like you said, he can turn into a Dirk Nowitzki type player, one of the best, but he can also just be another Darko Milicic, who's just another bust. So you really don't know. You're going to have to take the risk, and I think the Suns can afford that risk.
And lastly, for the ones that we really want to highlight and discuss here, we're going to go over to the number 5 pick of the Minnesota Timberwolves. They had a bounce-back year this year, so they're really looking for somebody that can staple off the rest of their team, and they can really close up the gaps that they need to close. And for us, it's going to be Chris Dunn. What do you see in him, and what do you like?
I like Chris Dunn. He averaged 16 points, 5 rebounds, 6 assists a game this year. And on a team like Providence, who isn't that talented, I think it's a good jump. So I think that it's a great fit on the Timberwolves, and I like them because Rubio, he's either been sick or he's been hurt, and I think that if he ever gets hurt again, then he's a great replacement.
Now, if you could compare him to somebody in the NBA, best, worst case scenario, who are you going to put him at?
I would say best case scenario, we have a John Wall type player. I think he's what I really like about him, especially for this young Timberwolves team, is he'd be a rookie veteran because he came out of Providence. He played three or 4 years at Providence, and he has that leadership in his blood, and now he'll be coming over to a young team, and even though he's young and he'd be one of the youngest players, I feel like he can take over with the leadership. Like you said, if Rubio gets hurt, they have that good solid point guard, and I just like him overall. It's like the John Wall type comparison I see.
So moving on now, if you take a look over here, we have our 6 through 14 picks. These are the picks that we're not necessarily going to discuss all of them, but here we are going to highlight 3. And starting with Jaylen Brown, what do you guys like?
I like Jaylen Brown a lot. I think he's one of the most NBA-ready players. He's out of Cal. I think he's a small forward out of Cal. He's a great shooter. I think he's one of the most NBA-ready players. He's just a smart player. I don't really have a comparison for him. I mean, he's a good shooter. He's a good defender. He's kind of like a Brandon Ingram, just not as good. And I think a better shooter, not as physical. But I really like Jaylen Brown.
Now, moving over to number 8 to the Kings, we have Scalabissiere. He is a bit of a project, but what do you think about him?
I really like his story. He came from Haiti after the earthquake. He kept playing basketball. He got recruited by Kentucky. And this year, he didn't really have a great year, but he's kind of like Dragan Bender. He's a project who has a lot of potential, and I really like him for the future.
Me too.
And now I'm going to skip over to number 12, and this is going to be my guy of this year's draft. I like Denzel Valentine. I think that he's a fantastic basketball player out of Michigan State. He plays a good basketball game. He has that triple-double potential, but for me, he looks a lot like Draymond Green. He's a little bit shorter, and I don't think he's going to be able to guard the center position as well as Draymond does it. But I think that coming into this year's draft, Denzel Valentine could have been a top 10 pick, but I don't think any of the teams in the top 10 needed somebody like Valentine, so I think the Jazz are a perfect pick at 12. And Valentine, I watch out for him in the NBA because I think he's going to be fantastic. Now, before we wrap up the show, we do want to talk about the second round briefly and a few people who we think that might be a great fit to certain teams and could be steals in the second round of the draft. First of all, let's start with Thon Maker. He's a basketball player coming out of high school. We don't see a lot of high school basketball players coming into the NBA. We saw Kobe. We all saw how that one turned out. And what do you think about Thon Maker?
I like him a lot. I mean, he's a good player overall. He's really athletic, and I just think there's going to be a team somewhere that wants to take a chance on this young high school kid, like you said, like how the Charlotte Hornets did on Kobe. And I think whatever happens, I think this will be a good story to see if this will work for other high school kids that want to do the same thing.
So coming out of China, and this is also another international pick, it kind of jumps out of nowhere. Zhao Qi, he's been an interesting player. We don't really know how old he is. We definitely know how tall he is. He's a 7-footer. People say he could turn out to be like Shaq, but the biggest issue is how old is this guy? Do you like Zhao Qi in the second round? Do you think that he's somebody that people should go off and steal?
I do like Zhao Qi. I think he's a great player. I think that China is a great basketball league. I think he's learned a lot from playing overseas. I think that he'll be a solid second-round pick. I don't know if he's going to be a star in the league, but I think he'll be a solid role player.
And our last player before we wrap up the show is going to be Tyler Ulis out of Kentucky. He is a fantastic basketball player, some of the best basketball talent we've seen. But the problem with him and what's probably going to cause him to slip to the second round is his stature. Coming in at 5'9" and 150 pounds, it's not strong for a basketball player, but do you see him being a steal?
Well, like you said, I think he has a top 3 talent in this league. I mean, in this draft, I think he's the 3rd to 5th best player in the draft, but the size. He's 5'9", he's 150, and teams don't need to take that chance on someone that's so small that's going to get beat up in this league. So I don't really know where he's going to fall. I don't know if someone's going to take him really early. I don't know if no one's going to want to take him. But no matter where he goes, if he can build himself up, I think he's going to be one of the best players in the draft.
So that does wrap it up for us this week for dTSPN. We do want to let you know to tune in next week for our season finale of dTSPN. We will be giving out some season awards to sports in general, to some players, to some teams. Tune in for that. It's going to be great. Have a good one.